CARTA is a center for academic training and research on anthropogeny based at UCSD. Please look ahead and mark your calendar for Saturday, March 13th, 2021, to attend their next symposium on the altered state of the human mind, implications for anthropogeny. It's online and free. Go to carta.anthropogeny.org. Well, as Steve mentioned, we've had a last-minute change. We should have heard from a renowned physician scientist, Dr. Ajit Varki, co-director of CARTA. He was going to speak on the origins of humans and the implications for medicine. We will be rescheduling his talk for another time. He's had a dental emergency, but he did leave us with this comment. Quote, "Unlike chimpanzees, we humans tend to have problems due to crowding of our teeth in much smaller jaws. This may be aggravated in civilized humans due to less chewing of tough food." We all wish Dr. Varki a speedy recovery. In his place today, we have an excellent speaker, Lindsay Hunter. Lindsay is a paleoanthropologist, recently became CARTA's Community Engagement and Advancement Director. She, as Steve mentioned, has superbly coordinated the speakers for our master class. But she also has a story to tell. She received her master's degree from the University of Iowa. Her studies of human bone collections and fossils has spanned 5 continents, with major grants from the National Science Foundation and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. Lindsay is currently an archaeology PhD candidate at the University of Witwatersrand. From 2016 to 2019, Lindsay developed and managed the National Geographic-sponsored UMSACA, Public Paleoanthropology Project in Johannesburg, South Africa. Maybe she'll tell us a little bit about UMSACA. Her personal, educational, and philanthropic work was recently spotlighted on a National Geographic Explorer advertisement aired in Africa during 2018. Today, she will speak to us about the Rising Star expedition. In 2013, she was one of 6 advanced cave archaeologists nicknamed the Underground Astronauts, chosen to excavate the newly discovered Homo naledi. These remains were found deep within a cave system known as the Rising Star, located in the Cradle of Humankind, South Africa. Lindsay, thank you so much for stepping in for us today, and welcome.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Steve. And it's an absolute pleasure to join you again today. You may or may not have noticed that I've been sitting behind the CARTA logo, sitting in on the lectures throughout the series. And so I'm very humbled to now be contributing to that. So I will go ahead and jump right in. I am a trained paleoanthropologist, which gives me a different perspective than some of our other scientists that have spoken here. Is I'm specifically trained to work on fossil hominin anatomy. So I'm an osteologist. I study the shapes of the bones and the form and the function from that. And so I will give you a bit of the recap on human evolution that Professor Varki was hoping to share with you today. And he gives his regrets that he could not be here. But hopefully this will give you a little bit of extra context into how the story of all of us has been told and continues to unfold. So I began my story here on a very lucky Friday the 13th in September of 2013 with two good friends, cavers, Stephen Tucker, shown here, and Rick Hunter. Spoiler, now my husband. So these gentlemen were out for, as they like to say in South Africa, they were out for a Friday night jaw. This was a sneak out trip to a cave that was in the nearby Cradle of Humankind, Johannesburg, South Africa, which is actually the second most populous city in sub-Saharan Africa after Lagos, sits just outside this magnificent World Heritage Site. So you can see here, we're up sort of closer to northern portion of the country, and within the Cradle of Humankind itself, which is the Dolomite Band, which is preserved as part of this World Heritage Site, you'll see that these are some of the markings related to caves within the area. It's a highly speleological area. The dolomite itself making itself almost like Swiss cheese. It's not really great for building buildings upon it, although people do live there. But it's a rather sparsely populated area relative to its position near Johannesburg. So here's a recent view of the locality that I'm speaking of. And so this would be the main road that we would drive to reach the Cradle of Humankind. There's a gate just over here that denotes the heritage site. And this is a site that some of you may be familiar with. It's called Sterkfontein Caves. It's a very well-known fossil hominin site, which has been attributed to individuals from Australopithecus africanus, as well as potentially Africanus prometheus. If you've heard of the most complete early hominin skeleton that's been actually found anywhere in the world, nicknamed Littlefoot, that comes from Sterkfontein Caves, where there's actually an interpretation center and a cave tour as well. Directly across from that site is a hill that is the site of Swartkrans. Swartkrans is actually one of the sites known for earliest potential evidence of controlled fire. This is a very lightning struck region, and because of the lovely felt within the area, the grass, it burns on a regular basis, which it has for indeed probably since the times that our ancestors might have lived there. So the Swartkrans, that site then goes back to about 1.1, 1.5 million years ago. And directly across there from our landmark, which is the Swartkrans golf carts, because this is a tourist area, is a really unassuming hillside through which snakes the Rising Star cave system. And this is a newer site, Site 105, that's currently being excavated and shared with the world in real time over social media. So I can also speak to that a bit later. But this is what the guys were there for, the Rising Star system. And you'll see that this is a cave map, which indicates several different names. At that time, they typically would speak of this area as Westminster. You'll see that there's also Empire, Bed Spring, Rising Star. There's fantastic names for all of these caves. And the best part of finding one of these rooms is that often you get to put your name or mark on it in some way. So what you'll see with these lines here are where different cave maps have been stitched together. So multiple openings into what turns out to be a rather large system, which is continuously being pushed or extended. And those are the connection points where they realize that they all hook up. It looks a bit to the layperson, to me as well, like an ant farm. This gives you a different view of that same area. This is the path that Rick and Stephen took on that night on Friday the 13th in 2013. And the reason that this looks like cloud formations is because they are clouds. They're point clouds. These are 3D imaging of this route within the cave, where we're highlighting just one route. So this entire area is actually honeycombed with more caverns and potential squeezes, but this is the route that they had taken and the route that was and continues to be used for the expedition. So you'll see that there's some points that are a bit tight. And I'll show these to you in just a moment. This is the one known as the Superman's Crawl. Then you proceed up the Dragon's Back, which is a large pendant of dolomite that had fallen from the ceiling probably several million years ago, that now you climb over, and it gives you a boost into a small maze-like area that has as one of its feeding points what we've referred to as the chute. You'll see the dotted line there. That is because the chute is so close in your quarters that you're using a handheld scanner and you can't move it around your body. So we haven't yet been able to image that. And then that opens up into a larger room now known as the Denaletti chamber. So on that night, they went through what we call the walk-in entrance, because there are lots of other fun ways to get in. My favorite being the one that's called the upside down turnaround, where you literally have to go down onto your head and put your arms out to catch yourself from falling, and then you snake around a turn. It's really, really awesome, but this one's a little bit safer looking, at least. This is the Superman Crawl. So as you proceed to the point that these gentlemen actually explored on that evening, you're going through what they would term a sporty cave. So it's one that a lot of people have actually caved there since the 1970s. It's been very well known. The entire area is very well explored, at least by cavers. And here I say cavers in contrast to spelunkers, or what in South Africa they term the torch and techie brigade. Techie being tennis shoes and torches, of course, being flashlights that just sort of go off to check something out. This is actually a much more systematic way of pushing the limits of the cave as well as yourself, and having the enviable honor of sometimes being the first human to set eyes on a section of the earth, which is not something that everyone can claim these days. So this is my husband, Rick, within that Superman Crawl. Typically, we would go in head first. So you're on your belly, but it's so tight that you have to put one arm ahead of you and one arm back. So you kind of look like Superman flying. You then use your feet to sort of kick yourself along like a little bit of a dolphin kick. And after you've gone through about 10 meters of that, you then are going to reach a section, which is a larger chamber known as the Dragon's Back chamber. And this is the Dragon's Back. Now, normally you won't see nearly so many electrical cords in a cave. And in fact, this cave now has the dubious honor of having the best Wi-Fi and internet in that portion of South Africa. The cave has the best reception. But this is the Dragon's Back. So you can see you climb up over on this side, and if you can visualize crawling from the tail of a dragon up along that spiny back as it continues up further and further, then what happens is it opens up into a short gap, which we call the leap of faith, because couldn't hold on to anything. You just have to jump across this and possibly fall 12 meters down, which would really make for a bad day. And it then blows out into what look like beautiful formations, beautiful stalactites. And so after going to the top of the Dragon's Back with the aim of photographing some of these beautiful stalactites and formations, Rick found that Stephen was in his way and that he needed him to find some place to stash himself while he took these photos. And so this is a shot that is actually from later on in the expedition in 2013 that shows what we call the chute. I've heard this likened to a shark's maw, that you look like you're climbing into a pointy toothed mouth. But Stephen just saw a gap, and he's a caver, so he just fit himself into it. So it's the if I fits, I sits philosophy. And to give you an idea of how tight this ended up being and the kind of mindset of the individuals involved, Stephen found that below his feet there was nothing else there. And so he thought, I will just continue to travel down this hole, because that made sense to him at the time. And so as he did so, it would have looked something like this. Imagine that you are squeezing down between 2 3-story buildings and crawling through spaces that at one time are like moving through a tennis racket or a soccer ball, so about 7 inches. I've seen easier births.
The man is hopelessly insane.
That is, that's my husband, totally insane. And that's Pedro Bosov, who we'll speak about in just a moment, who is giving that commentary. So once Stephen found that he was able to continue into an open chamber, he yelled up to Rick with the 2 words that every caver wants to hear: "It goes," which means that, the adventure and can proceed. We can keep pushing this. We can keep trying to see where the limits of this is and know a bit more about our subterranean world. And so this is the chamber that they found themselves in after having snaked down just a little bit, because without a second thought, Rick just popped down as well. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as easy as just popping down, because at the bottom of that 3-story gap, you just suddenly are about 10 meters off the ground and pop. So they had to free climb down, and probably a lot of stumbling and falling involved. but what they saw around them was a chamber that, for them, they're focused on these. These are the dog legs. These are little blind alleys. We're focused on, as scientists interested in early human origins, the bones. Now, it's not unusual to find bones in any cave system. There are a number of reasons. Death traps are a major accumulative aspect to South African caves in particular. You tend to have these wild olive and white stinkwood trees that will form in the crevices of one of these cave openings on the surface. And because their roots and a lot of the tree body is sometimes protected from the fires by the cave itself, you will have these clumps of trees showing up on the landscape, which allow you to potentially identify that there's probably a cave near those clumps. But also some predators will, like leopards, they're ambush predators, and so they will sneak up and then put their kill up in a tree because they're not confident of their abilities to be able to fight off other creatures, so they just stash it far away. Over time, those bones then may start to fall down into the cave itself as they decay, or you have a really bad day and the kind of clumsiness that characterizes me, and you're walking along on the landscape until, whoops, you're not. You are now part of the underground landscape and fall many meters to your death. So these are all accumulations, as well as some animals, porcupines, and other kinds of creatures like buck that you wouldn't normally think of snacking on bones. Do actually chew upon those bones for the calcium, as well as in the case of rodents and porcupine accumulations, it files down their ever-growing teeth. So they see bones. That's fine. Doesn't faze them. They see this one, and you don't have to be a scientist, just someone who's maybe had a look inside your mouth as you're brushing your teeth to go, wow, that looks really uncomfortably human. And so when they saw this portion of mandible, they actually thought that they had maybe found the last person who had been down inside this chamber. And this was the reason that it was not on the cave surveys, that it was not a known space, because they didn't make it back up. They did make it back up, though, fortunately. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, they spoke with other members of the caving club, because there's a lot of politics involved in well, obviously finding human remains within a cave, and cavers don't really like to attract that kind of attention. And so it took a while before they finally came to the conclusion that these were possibly more recent or more ancient remains, and they might share this information with someone else. Now, Pedro Boshoff, who you see here, he's a big Afrikaans Dutchman. So he's a member of the caving club, of the Speleological Exploration Club, of which Rick and Stephen were members. And he had asked them that if they saw something that looked like this, now this is a portion of a Paranthropus mandible or lower jaw. So you can see Paranthropus, sometimes known as the robust Australopithecines, if you can think all the way back to Professor Schoenigen's first lecture. They had an adaptation for processing tough roots and nuts more effectively in their vegetarian diet, which then affected the rest of their cranium. They have a quite robust head that comes to a bit of a point, much like that of a gorilla. So if you've ever seen a gorilla and wondered, why do they have that kind of pointy head? It's because of these temporalis muscles that assist you when you're chewing. And if you put your hands on either side of your head and chew, you can actually feel them. I am sorry to report that in all of the human dissections that I've done, our temporalis muscles are just, they're really not impressive at all. They just like look like a few strings. But what in Paranthropus has happened is they're chewing very, very strongly, and muscle has to attach somewhere. And so it stimulates bone growth. And in this case, there's nowhere else for the bone to go. And so it creates this kind of crest or keel. So that's a little bit more information you probably needed for this one, but that's why they have then the corresponding massive lower jaw, as everything is oversized there because of this masticatory complex that they exhibit. So, having heard of this mandible and requesting photos from Stephen and from Rick stealing his mother's sewing measuring tape to photograph these, they go back, start photographing the signs, and then end up rocking up at Professor Lee Berger, who is a National Geographic Explorer in residence, as well as a professor at the University of the Witwatersrand, and a person with which Pedro had worked in the past because he was a geology student, and he had shared some of this information with Professor Berger. So they end up at his house about 10 p.m. at night. I don't know if you're familiar with South Africa at all, but you don't just walk up to someone's house, not ever. There's always a fence or a security gate. And so they buzz in, and Pedro said, "You're gonna wanna let us in." This is how Lee likes to tell the stories, that because he looks, well, let's face it, he looks a little bit dodgy. He was a mercenary in northern Africa, and so I think that Lee likes to pretend that he was not sure about letting them in because it was late at night and sounded a little bit sketchy. But in the end, they did let them in. Pedro and Stephen were able to share the photographs that Rick and Stephen had taken. And we think the reason that Professor Berger didn't want them to come in is because Pedro can talk the hind leg off a donkey. And so he must have figured, well, I'm probably not going to sleep tonight. Once he saw the photos, he did realize, I'm probably not going to go to sleep tonight, because in looking at those, he was able to determine that there was something very special here. Because he was the right person, approached at the right time for this. He had recently been installed as a National Geographic Explorer in residence. That's Professor Berger right here, next to a reconstruction of a juvenile skeleton of Australopithecus sediba, which had been previously discovered first by his son, 9-year-old Matthew Berger, in 2008, and that had recently been shared with the world in 2010. So in 2013, he was ready for some new finds, and he knew right away that he was looking at something special. So he called quickly National Geographic that evening and spoke to the grants department and told them, if you have believed in me before, I need you to trust me now. We need to work very quickly, and we don't know what the condition of the site is. We know that recreational cavers are able to now know of it and are able to access it, and we want to prevent any kind of compromise from occurring to that site. And so he then basically was issued a blank check by National Geographic and sent a now famous Facebook post that went around the world, searching for skinny scientists. You don't have to try and read through all of this, but essentially what they were looking for is someone who had the appropriate training in terms of an understanding of osteology and archaeological recovery, but they also had to be small and athletic, not claustrophobic, and had to work well in teams. There's no age limit put on this, although they were looking at people from master's to PhD, that they were looking at early career and individuals to take part. I happened to see the announcement at a time where I was ready to get out of paleoanthropology, but it sounded like a lark and appeals to a certain kind of really stupid person. So I was the kind of person who would be targeted by the Shackleton, famous message that a safe return cannot be assured, but in case you live, that glory, that can be assured. So I was like, this sounds cool. They're paying for all of it. I'll just put my hat in. And little did I know that within a very short period of time, so this has gone from September 13th was the original discovery in 2013, that I was on the ground in South Africa in the beginning of November of that same year. So this is like lightning speed for paleoanthropology. And I was a member of a all-female team comprised of women that were coming from all around the world, but also mostly from the United States. So we have Becca Peixoto, Alia Gertov coming from the US, Ellen Farragill coming to us from Australia, Marina Elliott from Canada, that is me, then Lindsay Eves, and then Hannah Morris, who's also American. This, I should note that Professor Lieberger, if any of you are familiar and have followed any of his work, he has a real eye for publicity, and he actually came out of a news background. So he wanted to recreate the right stuff astronaut pose there, and rather dubiously dubbed the women underground astronauts, because he felt that we had that same kind of gravity or of preparing to risk our lives for the unknown. I will say that it makes a certain amount of sense in that once you are underground, you are quite cut off from the rest of the outside world. And it was only through a lot of procedures that had been put in place to enhance communication that we really felt safe in that kind of setting. So here again is that unassuming hillside. People are walking over this every day, and people could see there's these lumps of and clumps of trees. So it was known that these caves are there. People would go there, but it wasn't seen as a really big thing. So we pitched our tents, and for the next 3 weeks, we had a intense expedition throughout the month of November in 2013. Now, to give you an idea of the working conditions here, most of South Africa, the fossils that are well known and indeed well preserved are well preserved because of a double-edged sword, which is the dolomitic rock that the water precipitates through in creating stalactites and other features within a cave. As that water percolates through, it picks up this calcium carbonate, and it then imbues the surrounding soil that it comes through. And in doing so, it essentially fossilizes it. It concretizes everything in situ in place. So that's why here we see Professor Ron Clark, who's also from the University of Witwatersrand, in what became like a couple decade labor of love to extract a full female Australopithecus, as he's called, Prometheus skeleton named Littlefoot from Sterkfontein Caves. So you can see he's actually working with a dental drill. You can also see that he's not really doing the work here. This is a publicity photo because indeed you need to wear a mask as well as eye protection, because you have little chips of material that's breaking off. So this is kind of like when your dentist comes in and removes the dental calculus. They're removing all of the extraneous soil from the outside of the fossilized specimen. In the case of the Rising Star cave system, to which we had come from around the world to work on, because we had the skills and because we were small and athletic and no shortage on enthusiasm, so therefore not always making the best life choices there. We had a very different type of setting. We basically were just pulling things off the surface for a long period of time, because it's a loose clay setting. So already you can see that the dynamics within these caves differ depending on when different sections of the caves open to the outside, and how much additional fossilization is able to occur through the permeation of that calcium carbonate. So what we have here are actually loose clay bones that are subfossilized. So your bone already starts off having a significant portion of it inorganic. So it's sort of like partly fossil to begin with. And during the process of fossilization of one of these bones, what happens is that the organic material, of course, is going to deteriorate, leaving gaps, which the external soil matrix, wherever it is, surrounding it, starts to then permeate into those bones and fill those spaces with minerals. So they become decalcified and remineralized. These are in the decalcified state. So that means that they're very fragile. In working with these bones, you had to be very careful. You can see that there's a lot of bright white here, which indicates fresh breaks to them. That's recent damage, which was one reason that Professor Berger had pushed to go ahead with the expedition so quickly, was he thought that there was good reason to believe that the bones might undergo further damage should they be left there. So in working with those bones, they felt a little bit like damp sidewalk chalk. So you had to be very careful. That chunky sidewalk chalk, if you can kind of use a fingernail and scrape a little bit off the top. That was entirely possible here as well. So rather than using the dental drill or the air scribe type of methodology that we saw Ron Clark exhibiting with Littlefoot in the breccia, which is that just conglomerate of soil and rocks and other class of bones, we had to be very, very careful. So you can see that we're using very tiny paint brushes, that we have plastic spoons to move the soil. We're working in confined conditions, and using a little bamboo sticks to remove soil very gently, and porcupine quills if we were feeling fancy. So it is a bit darker than most expeditions that people will go on. And here you can see the assembly of the plastic tools here. And Aaliyah and Hannah hard at work over a section that was towards the back of the first room in the Dinaledi chamber, which we called the puzzle box. We called it the puzzle box for the fact that it was like expert level pickup sticks. We believe that there's a natural drain there, and that over time materials had found their way there. And as it's in a turn in the cave, they all got sort of stuck on the drain. And so it was like the best excavation ever, because often when you're excavating, you're not really finding many things so much as different changes in soil color, which it's easy to lose your enthusiasm about that rather quickly. But we were also working in tight spaces, so some of the methodologies had to be adapted to that. You'll see the gold arrow here is pointing to a total station. So these are different kinds of survey equipment that are often used within caves and above ground sites that allow us to determine where in 3D space within a setting that materials are coming from. We did not have that same luxury of space. And so what you see here looks like, what do I have there? In Hannah's hand is a handheld 3D strobe digitizer from RTAC called the EVA. And so she's being guided by another one of the scientists here. And essentially, like a steam iron, it's about the same size as a steam iron. And I freely admit that I am analogizing this with steam irons, not being someone who uses irons, because archaeologists, why? But I understand that a steam iron, if you hold it over something, you press a button, steam comes out, you need to cover that whole section completely. And that's exactly what is being shown here is hold over, press the button, and a strobe white light then captures the coordinate data in 3D space. And this image that you see on the laptop is showing where there are areas with incomplete coverage or gaps that need to essentially be washed over by that light so that we have a robust picture of what's actually there. So when you look at that data in false color, you can see differences in terms of the different shapes and materials. You can see that there's actually an articulated hand here. You can see some lower limb, long bone elements. But when you put it in real color, it looks like a photograph. This is that same technology now being shown with each one of these little labels here, indicating the museum accession number for that bone before it was removed, which is of course extensively documented because during the course of your excavating a site, you are actually destroying it. You're removing the context of how everything got to be where it was. And so it's very important that you document bit by bit where everything was relative to one another, to the surface, etc. Because only then are we able to later go back and tell patterns related to potentially how the materials got there. Were they dropped there over time at different time periods? Were they washed in? There's a lot that these orientations can tell us. Here's me happily just working away. One of the things that was unusual about this expedition was the fact that we were on camera all the time. We had security cameras that were set up in various spots throughout the cave. that were hooked up by my husband. And this allowed us to have full communication with individuals throughout the cave. We also had members of the Speleological Exploration Club that were supporting the 6 women advanced cave scientists that were actually going in and doing the excavating while they made sure we didn't die. At the time, we called this the Brady Bunch cam view or Hollywood Squares, but now it just looks like Zoom view because we're now all used to that kind of setup. Here you'll see just quickly the first scans that were coming up from the surface. It was an incredibly moving moment. Here you can see me standing right here. And here we have an underground phone line that is allowing Professor Berger, who was not able to fit down into the small chamber through this chute. He's had to work vicariously by individuals you trust working below. One dirty secret I found out about myself while working on this project was that as a paleoanthropologist, I actually enjoyed living people more than I did dead people. They're better conversationalists, for one thing. And so this expedition in 2013 essentially changed my orientation to wanting to share the enthusiasm for this kind of work with other groups. And so here you can see us actually on site during the 2013 expedition doing live classroom Skype to the United States. And that's been a continuing theme. We started cataloging and moving all of the materials into what we call the science tent, which did have vaults, although I would be hard pressed to guess what might have happened with the bones. There is occasionally use of bones for moody or traditional remedies. But we just needed to get more vaults because, as it had turned out, once enlisting the help of an early career, and I'll come to your question just one moment, Mr. Dahlberg, is that in May of 2015, an additional, or 2014, a additional amazing thing occurred, which was an early career workshop to describe these remains in a very equitable way. You'll actually see in the back here is Professor John Hawks, who is a CARTA member now and who spoke on hominileti earlier in this year in February. And so most of the young men and women that you see here are early careers. So that is that they are either in the last push to their PhD or within the first 5 years of their career. And these are not the kinds of people who typically are able to have their names or descriptions of bones in these prestigious journals, just because that's how the game's set up. But you can see that the strength of an approach whereby you use small units of individuals who are regional specialists and who work in concert with one another on a part of the body. So here we see the skull team. They're looking at actually a mandible because they're looking for presence or absence of chin. The projecting chin is a more recent Homo sapiens trait. And in total, what all of these groups were able to tell us together was that we had at least 15 individuals that were represented within the discovery. That's what we call an MNI, the minimum number of individuals that could account for this assemblage. Because of course, maybe every one of those bones is a different individual. So an MNI, the minimum number of individuals, that allows us to say we're grouping based off of what we can tell in terms of what was probably the biological sex or the age of the individual. You don't want to have two right arms. That's probably not going to make sense. So once you have accounted for all of those differences and put things into areas that make sense, what goes like with like, we had something like this. And this is over 1,550 specimens at that time. Most specimens that I worked on are like super small. So the fact that my young son, he's just now 5, but he could do this at 3, he could point to part of the skeleton and point to it on a living human skeleton. Not because he's a savant, regrettably, but because these are very recognizable as bones, not just as pieces. And so this is actually the way that they were presented in a public ceremony at the World Heritage Site. And so you can see that these are different parts from the head, the teeth, the head going down. And this is actually a composite individual. This isn't one person. It's easier to tell this kind of thing when you're there and seeing it up close, but you can see the bone here. It's sort of like a snail-like looking bone. It's called the talus. I don't know why I have an obsession with that bone. It looks like a snail, but it takes a lot of your body weight. And so it's often used in estimations of body mass. And so for that, you could even just use your eyes to see this is a much smaller talus than this one. It couldn't come from the same individual, even if they were limping, because then you would see some other kinds of changes. This is what the reconstruction of a composite skull, as no one complete skull was found originally in 2013. And they reconstructed Hominaleti, very famous scientific illustrator and artist, John Gurche. He's done the Hall of Human Origins at Smithsonian. Many of you may have seen his work. And we found that Hominaleti apparently looked nothing more than like Grumpy Cat, the internet meme. What we found that was very interesting is that there's a mosaic of traits. And I will be wrapping this up, so I promise you can get to questions, is that those traits that were more axial rather than appendicular. The axial skeleton in some ways was more ancestral in its shape than the appendicular skeleton. So like your hands and your legs. So in determining that this was, after comparing it with the rest of the human fossil record, something new, something that did not fall within an accepted range of variation for all of the known different kinds of hominins or human ancestors. They designated this as Homo, so put it within our genus, and then recognized that it was something different, Naledi. Naledi is a Sotho for stars, and Sotho is one of the 11 official languages of South Africa, and one that's indigenous to this particular area, the Mogales region. And the reason it was, of course, given the name Naledi, or star, is the rising star chamber. Unfortunately, it confused a whole lot of South Africans because Naledi is also a name. like a very common name. Like I taught writing lessons to a girl named Naledi. And so people assume that from this meant that Homo naledi was a female, which was right and wrong because there were at least 15 individuals of all ages, some of which were female, some which were male, some which were juvenile, some were subadult, and some of which would have been while of a ripe age, probably would not have made it to being able to participate in Osher. So they were probably dying around the age of 40 or so. One of the interesting things about Homo naledi is the fact that it seemed to have a very small brain reconstructed when compared to some other species of early hominins. On the left-hand side, you can see sort of the differences between the different body shapes. We have Australopithecus afarensis, which is the Eastern African Lucy specimen. You can see this is a lot more of a ape-like proportion, that you have a very bell-shaped chest, a small cranium, so you don't see a lot of a forehead happening. You can also see that the limbs are in transition. The arms are still fairly long. They haven't moved to completely full faculty this is what we call facultative bipedality, that they can still climb well, but they do also walk bipedally, as indicated by the angles of the femur from the kneecap. Now, this is more recent individuals. This is sometimes known as Turkana boy or Neriokatomi. He's also from East Africa, and he shows the proportions that are more similar to those of individuals who live in that area today, which is very tall, long, and linear. So long arms, long body, and these are believed to be ecogeographically controlled traits, which help for shedding heat from a body, that tall, thin, linear, following Bergman's rule for the body and Allen's rule for the arms. Now, Homo naledi, he has somewhat more modern proportions, but this smaller head, and so that was very surprising, as well as the fact of a very curved phalanges or fingers. Not that like their hand would have been like this, but the actual bones themselves are more curved and ours are more straight. So they would have had a different kind of grip that potentially could have aided them in climbing within a rocky setting rather than what is always assumed, which is arboreal or in the trees, because that's our primates, as primates, that's our heritage, is from the trees. Now, this was a very provocative picture or illustration that was added from National Geographic as to a possible way that they had made their way into the caves. This did not ever happen. You'll actually see that if you're familiar with Renaissance and medieval iconography, this is very close to the same setup that you see for the burial of Jesus. And that's not trying to be disrespectful. It's an iconic image, which the illustrator decided to use here. But what we do know about this chamber, the Dinaledi chamber, as it was later called, Dinaledi Chamber of Stars, is that there wasn't this big gap, that they would have been coming down that same chute. And so if you were moving individuals into this space purposefully, which does appear to be the case because there has been no other explanation that covers it, such as accumulation of predators or even other animals. There haven't been washed in sediments So we think that they're actually moving their dead and separating them in what's been called the deliberate disposal hypothesis, which does not sound, which sounds rather sterile, but it also had impressed upon me Darwin's feeling when he had said that in speaking about his ideas on evolution by natural selection, he first felt as though he was confessing a murder, and but it just wasn't, it didn't feel right. So we had many nights around the campfire where everyone would be discussing the fact that it looks like they're burying them, they're putting them for some reason. And no one wanted to say that because they did not look like individuals that are more like us, that it was very difficult for us to process that perhaps this small-brained hominin was in fact intentionally disposing of their dead, and we couldn't know what that meant to them, because previously our earlier burials are known from the much later Neanderthals, which are closer to us. But you can see how this would have then moved down from the vertical shaft, and that bones could have then moved towards the strain, and this was the primary excavation area of the puzzle box. So this was then all announced to great fanfare in 2015, and that's me, and basically the coolest picture that has ever been taken of me in my entire life, done by Dr. Ellen Farragle, where I'm just sitting in my cave office and working on the scans there. So to follow, this has been shared now with people from around the world at the World Heritage Site Visitor Center, Marapang. And in fact, a exploration team was even put together, made up of South Africans and led by Marina Elliott, to continue to push the areas in that system and see what had been missed. One thing which had been missed was that on the last day of that expedition in 2013, Rick and Stephen, because they couldn't sit still and listen to instructions, went wandering off into the cave and found another chamber that's now known as the Lassetti chamber, the Chamber of Light. And that was shared with the public in 2017. So it's about 70 meters underground, as the crow flies underground, but about 140 meters of twisting and turning. And to give you an idea of how hideous this is, we have one section, it's called Pinch and Punch, which is absolutely awful. And this later chamber revealed more remains, also attributed to Homo naledi. And so fortunately for us, this gave us the ability to test the hypothesis of the first reconstructed cranium, because there was a relatively complete male cranium of a young adult who's since been named Neo, meaning gift. So you can see in comparison, the actual cranial capacity is greater than what had been predicted within the reconstruction. And you can also see that, wow, there's a very projecting face. There's a significant amount of prognathism, which is surprising because we tend to see those in much earlier ancestral lineages. So in comparison, here you can see the very complete neo adult skeleton. There was also a portion of another adult and a baby within the Lassetti chamber. And here you can see that compared with how complete the famous Lucy skeleton is. So I think I will wrap this up quickly here. For a long time, we didn't know how old hominileti was. And so we were using our best estimates based off of the physical traits or the morphology, what different pieces look like, and transitions over time. And looking at the traits of hominileti all together, putting it as something that was probably one of us, Homo, but yet different as in terms of nileti. We're thinking that it might go back as far as about 1.5 million years, or even a little bit more than that. Here you can see around that time in this, I love this, this graphic. So this allows you to see the time depth here on the left-hand side, and then the position of these individuals, groups them both in terms of geographic or morphological similarity, as well as in time. So we can see that hominileti falls into a rather interesting radiation of changes early in the Homo lineage. And that's significant because it's about that time that our genus first emerges and then leaves Africa, starts to follow the animals that are starting to move out of the area due to cooling trends and drying trends. And they follow where the food goes. But as they come into these different environments, you see lots of different kinds of local adaptations. So here we compare now to archaic Homo sapiens. So this is an older Homo sapiens from Kabwe, Zambia. This is sometimes also known as the Broken Hills specimen. So what we've actually found is this is around the same time frame that Neo would have been living. And you can see this is a very much more ancestral looking face. It's a lot more projecting than that of Kabwe, which is much more ornathic or pushed in. And you can see that the cranial capacity is much smaller. These are to scale. And then finally, when comparing Neo to the so-called modern Homo sapiens at the site of Omakibish, we're looking at about 195,000 years ago. You can see this is Omakibish. This is just the brain case. So much larger. Again, the story continues. There's a new generation of South African scientists, particularly young women, that are working on this, and you can continue to follow the expedition today. And you can always contact me at CARTA, and my email there, and I also have that shared with Stephen, with Eileen. And it is not just my pleasure to speak with you, it is literally my job. So please, any questions, feel free. And I can also pass those on to other individuals as well. So this is me, and there's Rick, that's my husband. So it was an incredible experience that gave me a lot of insight into the behind stage stuff behind one of these big finds. And working within the Cradle of Humankind was a very eye-opening experience, and has made me even more passionate about trying to share these kinds of understandings about who we are, where we've come from, where we might be going with others such as you. So we hope that you'll join us in winter and spring of 2021 for our upcoming CARTA Symposia. Details are on our website, carta.anthropogeny.org. We have the altered states of the human mind as well as human physical activity. So provocative ones coming up. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer those at this time.